Today I'm going to show you tons and tons of sampling techniques, sampling tips, and sampling tricks in this video. This is probably my most in-depth sampling video ever, so if you want to improve at sampling, this video is for you. Alright, first let's start with a sample. Sometimes what I like to do is start with a single sound or a one-shot, but the type of one-shot that you start with can make a big difference. A lot of this is about experimenting, which is at times about throwing logic out the window and doing things that don't really quite make sense. Overall though, I just hope this goes better than the last time I experimented. Welcome to my new YouTube channel. Today I'm going to show you how to use a hammer. First you want to hold it here, and then put your nail in the wall. Hopefully these wires don't cause a problem. And then to use your hammer, do this. I like the idea of starting this beat by building a unique layer right from the jump. And one way to do this is by using a sample that has just a few layers in it. For example, this sample here. You can hear it sounds like we have an organ layered with a piano. There might be a pad behind it as well. This is just a great starting point. The sample is just thin enough to allow us to manipulate it a little bit more easily, but also has enough layers where once we start manipulating it, we can create a unique result compared to if I just started with a regular stock piano one shot, for example. Let me show you what I mean though. I'm gonna start testing out different ideas to really push this sample in different ways. For example, one really common technique is to reverse your sample. This is something that I talked about in my older sampling video, where I talked about how to effectively reverse samples and choose the best types of samples to do this technique. A piano, for example, can suddenly sound a lot more unique when we reverse it. And to go back to my previous point, this is also why using a one-shot or a sample that has multiple layers can be far more effective when trying to produce a unique sound. So you can imagine using a sample that has multiple sounds in it, and then reversing that will result in creating something that's even more unique. And for me, a lot of my favorite beats have that in commonality. They just have these layers where you have no idea what the sound even is, and I lose an understanding of what sounds I'm even hearing. And reversing your sample can be one way of creating this in your beat. Another technique is to play around with the start and the end time of your sample as well. Here, I'm just looking for a random moment, a brief little glimpse that catches my attention. Sometimes we can find a really unique moment where the different layers within the sample may be coming in and out, for example. Another great idea is to play around with the sample far away from its original pitch. Again, we can really contort and mess with the perception of what we're even hearing. I like the way this is sounding, so here what I'm going to do is use this layer as the bedrock to build around. I think this is going to be effective. This is something that I talked about in a video about the Alchemist production techniques, where some of his beats just use a single pad or synth or drone, and it just consistently plays one note. Then he layers other sounds and samples on top, and that's exactly what I'm going to do using this layer. A couple of extra things that I want to do though, I think I want to shorten the length of this tone. I think having it consistently playing at this level might become overbearing. So I'm going to turn the envelope control on and really shorten the sound, but increase the release. I'm also going to play with the velocity of certain notes, so we have this sort of in and out feeling to this pattern. And by the way, if you guys like these longer over-explained type videos, let me know by hitting the like button. It'll help the video perform a lot better, therefore it will give me an incentive to do more of these. Next, I'm going to use some of my experimental effects with this sample. Again, this is pure experimentation. I'm not sure what outcome I'm even looking for here fully, but hopefully this goes better than my last experiment. Welcome to my new YouTube channel. Today I'll show you how to make sauce. Step 1 is to add mayonnaise. Next you want to add mustard. And then finally, a drop of hot sauce. So I'm going to start by using Sigmund. This is one of my go-to plugins when I want to experiment. You can take your sounds and patterns and really play around with the rhythm and what space they take up. So I'm just going to cycle through these presets and see what I can find. So I really like this preset. It has a spacey feel to it and it created this really unique rhythm. So I'm going to start with this. I will say though that there is that piercing tone, so I'm going to use an EQ to really control and bring it down a bit. Next up, I'm going to use Shaper Box for much the same reason I use Sigmund. It's one of my go-tos for playing around with loops and messing with space and time. I think I like this preset. It reinforces that original idea of this layer coming in and out, primarily because of the filtering here. One thing that you can hear is that we have some slight clicking and popping. This is probably due to the filter making these quick, drastic jumps. So if I make this jump a bit more gradual, that should get rid of that clicking noise. Next up, I'm going to add some decimort. I want to add a layer of noise on top of this sample so it doesn't sound quite as dead. I've talked about how helpful this concept is in my prior over-explained video. I like what this layer is doing so far. Next, let's move on to find another sound that could work with this layer. I like this sound here, very spacey, and that feels in line with what I'm building. As you can hear, this is a single note one shot as well, which can be a good idea to use right now, since it'll just be easier to create a more musical pattern using a single note sound. First, let's see which notes feel like they fit with my first layer here. So I like the way those three notes sound. I'm going to build a pattern using them, but I think playing them in a lower octave will be more helpful to make this beat sound a little bit more complete though. But first, let me manipulate the sound a little bit. What I'm going to do is use some techniques similar to what I did with my first layer, like reversing the sample and playing around with the start and the end time. I'm also going to play around with the polyphony. I want to introduce a bit of glide to whatever pattern that I play. I just like the way it sounds, no other real reason beyond that. So let's go ahead and build a pattern out here. I think adding some effects onto the sound will really help it sit better in the beat as well. I'm going to start with a flanger. As you can see, I put my first layer closer into mono, so I want to bring out more stereo presence with this sound. Next up, a little bit of Saturn just to add a little bit more presence. I'm also going to add a little bit of delay as well. So this is sounding cool to me, but as of right now, it feels like I have a lot of spacey, ethereal sounds, but nothing really sounds very present in my beat right now. I feel like I need to ground this beat a little bit and maybe establish some sounds in the foreground, so let's see what we have here. Actually, since we're experimenting, what I'm going to do is use that straightforward piano sound that I had here, but I'm going to use it in a bit of a unique way by really constricting the start and end time here. And now what I'm going to do is use this sound almost percussively. Here we've basically used a piano sample to create a really unique percussion sound. Alright, I like the way everything's coming together so far. Next, I'm going to add in some bass. I know with a lot of my tutorials, I've used electric basses or jazz basses, so let's do something a bit different this time. What I'm going to do is use a synth bass. I think that would be a really different texture. So first thing I'm going to do is add some distortion to really bring out this synth bass's color. The synth bass also has a lot of stereo presence. It's going all over the place, as you can see. So I think it'd be a good idea to put the lower bass frequencies in mono to avoid any issues. Alright, now let's create a bass line. This kind of reminds me of a Schoolboy Q beat, sorta, kinda. One of the things that I like about some of his production is that it often uses synthetic modern textures with more classic drums. I think that'd be a cool direction to take this beat. So I'm gonna go ahead and look through some of my beat batter drum breaks. I think this one's perfect. I really like the rhythm, so I'm not even gonna bother chopping and rearranging it. I'm just gonna pretty much leave it as it is. I do want this drum break to be a larger part of the beat overall, so I'm gonna layer some separate drum sounds underneath. First off, I'm gonna grab all the kicks from this loop. Copy and paste these over into my kick layer and then limit the notes. This is yet another trick that I showed you in an older over-explained video, which I will link in the description box below. Next up, I'm going to reinforce that unique rhythm in this drum loop by using a separate hi-hat layer. The snare in this drum loop is a bit further back sounding. Layering a more percussive short sound with a strong attack might help here. So I layered this side stick and the snare sounds a bit more robust and a bit more forward in the beat as well. It's subtle, but I think it'll help. I think the high end of this beat is a bit dead. It could use a bit more presence. So what I will do is try to add in a ride. These rides are a tiny layer by all means, but I do feel it helps a bit. I feel like all these sounds that I have make up a good core loop. I want to play around with even more samples to show you even more sampling tips, so we will use these new layers that I'm about to add for the different parts of my arrangement. One tool that comes to mind is the stock FL Granulizer. This is a great tool to use when you're trying to experiment with your samples. Sometimes I will say though, experimenting can really lead you to some dark places. Welcome to my new channel. I should stick to making beats. Anyways, how you use this is you drag your sample in, and what it does is it chops up your sample into small pieces or grains and plays them back to you based on whatever settings that you choose. So first, let's find a cool one shot to use with this thing. This isn't really a one shot, but there's that brief moment in this sample that sounded really cool to me. I like that bending note here, so what I'm going to do is start to play with some of these parameters. And I'm going to use that sound to create a pattern. One extra thing that I want to do though, I will also use that same glide technique here. So I like this pattern, but one thing that's a bit of a problem here, I like the way this glide sounds when the pattern starts at the high note. But as you can hear, if we continue along this pattern, the glide doesn't start at that high note as soon as we get to the next part of the pattern. The reason being, the last MIDI note that's being played here is going to dictate where the starting point will be for the next note when the glide is turned on. So what we're hearing when you get to this point of the pattern, once we get to this note right here, is that this E note is actually starting from a B carried over from this last MIDI note, and then it glides up to an E and then it goes back down. But again, what I want here is for this note to just start at an E instead of starting at a B. Now one way we can solve this problem is by just printing this pattern out and using it as a sample. But another way is that we can add a ghost note at a really low volume. That can work at times. So if we add an E note right here and bring the volume down, that way this MIDI note right here will trigger and our bend goes back to an E. But since the volume is just so low, we won't actually hear it. But in this case, as you can hear, this solution doesn't really work. It still plays this note right here briefly. I'm gonna be 100% honest, I'm not sure why. I believe this might be because the fact that I'm using a granulizer as a host, maybe the velocity is programmed a bit differently in the FL Granulizer. Either way, we can hear this note and I'm gonna have to figure out a different workaround. Instead, what I can do is automate the volume of this pattern so we don't hear this note. So what I'm gonna do is go into the control section down here and play with the channel volume. So once we get to this part of the pattern, the volume is going to go all the way down, and then it will go back up for the next part. So there we go. I'm going to add a bunch of reverb onto this sound as well to make it spacey. Alright, so I really like the way this is sounding. I'm going to add in yet another layer. Maybe I'll use this different layer for some other section of the beat. I think adding a vocal sample might be cool, but I'm going to use yet another tool in order to manipulate this sample. Here I'm going to use Iris. This is a tool that I talked about in a video I made a little while back. It's something that a lot of my favorite producers use to really experiment with their samples. Instead of sitting here and explaining this plugin again, I'm just going to drop the link to that video in the description box below. In fact, let's go ahead and jump into the arrangement at this point. This beat is getting really massive. We have a lot of layers, so let's figure out what we're going to do with all these patterns. Alright, so here's the full arrangement. A few things to point out. During the hook section, I did a few more layering techniques to make this section of the beat sound bigger. One thing that I did was I took that first layer that I showed you, and then I pitched it up an octave and layered it on top. Very standard technique here. As well, I wanted to make this bass sound bigger. So what I did was I layered this saw wave synth on top of it. And that's how this section ended up sounding a lot more large. As well, later on in the beat, I added this new layer right here. All I did was I used this MS-20 preset and I just added a bunch of delay. And you can see with this pattern that I built, I created this sort of back and forth idea with this sample right here and the MS-20 layer. Anyways, I've been talking long enough. Here is the full beat. And also, if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. Head over to betterbeatmaker.com to check out my full online beatmaking course. My free drum kit's also available in the description box below. And without further ado, here's the full beat.